You're standing in the center of a vast marble bathhouse, steam curling through shafts of afternoon light. The air is thick with rose oil and something sharper, vinegar perhaps, or the metallic tang of blood. Through an archway, you glimpse a woman being held down by 3 slaves while a fourth works methodically with heated bronze tweezers, pulling hair from her most intimate places. She doesn't scream. To scream would be to admit weakness, but tears stream silently down her painted face, white lead mixing with salt water, creating pale rivers through her makeup. In the adjoining chamber, a senator discusses grain prices with a colleague while a teenage slave boy massages oil into his shoulders, both men pretending not to notice when the senator's hand disappears beneath the bathwater. This is Tuesday in Rome. This is normal. Before we step deeper into these shadows, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from. It amazes me that we can gather from every continent to explore these uncomfortable truths together, separated by oceans but connected by curiosity about what humans are capable of. The year is 62 AD. Nero rules from the Palatine Hill, but the empire's true character isn't written in his decrees or military campaigns. It's written in the bedrooms, bathhouses, and back alleys, where power, flesh, and desperation create arrangements so alien to modern sensibilities that they feel like fiction. But they're not fiction. They're documented in marriage contracts preserved on bronze tablets, in medical texts describing procedures that would be classified as torture today, in graffiti scratched onto brothel walls by men who paid a day's wages for 10 minutes with a woman whose name they never learned. When Vesuvius buried Pompeii 17 years later, it preserved more than buildings. It preserved the physical evidence of a society that had systematized the intimate parts of human life into hierarchies as rigid as any military structure. What we're about to explore isn't sensationalism, it's archaeology, the uncomfortable kind. The Roman concept of pudicitia gets translated as chastity or modesty, but neither word captures what it actually meant. It wasn't about sexual purity in the Christian sense that would later dominate Europe. It was about performing sexual availability in exactly the right measure for your social position. Too little, and you failed your duty to produce legitimate heirs and reflect your husband's virility. Too much, and you threatened the certainty of paternity that held the entire inheritance system together. Valeria Messalina understood this better than anyone, and it destroyed her. As Emperor Claudius's third wife, she had access to power that most Roman women could only imagine. She also had appetites that Roman society pretended women didn't possess. Ancient historians claimed she would sneak out of the palace at night, take a room in a common brothel, and compete with professional prostitutes to see who could service more clients before dawn. Whether these stories were true or political propaganda designed to justify her eventual execution, they reveal something crucial. The mere possibility that a woman might desire sex for her own pleasure, rather than dutifully submitting to her husband's needs, was considered evidence of moral corruption so profound it threatened the stability of the state. In 48 AD, Messalina went further. While Claudius was away from Rome, she married Gaius Silius, a young senator considered the most handsome man in Rome. The ceremony was public, complete with witnesses and sacrifices to the household gods. When Claudius returned and learned what had happened, the response was swift and absolute. Both Messalina and Silius were executed within hours. Not because of adultery alone. Roman law permitted wealthy men to divorce unfaithful wives and move on. They died because Messalina's sexual choice, her assertion of desire outside the framework of state-sanctioned marriage, represented a symbolic challenge to imperial authority itself. But Messalina was an empress. For ordinary women, the constraints were even tighter, and the consequences of violation even more brutal. A marriage contract from 134 AD, discovered in Egypt but reflecting standard Roman practice throughout the empire, includes this clause. The wife shall submit to her husband's sexual demands no fewer than twice weekly, unless prevented by illness, menstruation, or religious purification. She shall not refuse unusual requests unless they cause permanent physical injury. Failure to comply shall result in financial penalties deducted from her dowry. The contract continues for several more paragraphs, specifying the permissible forms of contraception, the division of any children should the marriage dissolve, and the circumstances under which the husband could take additional sexual partners without affecting the wife's financial position. This was a legal document, drawn up by families of considerable wealth and witnessed by multiple officials. It treated intimacy as a commodity to be regulated, measured, and enforced through financial penalties. The wedding night that followed such a contract was rarely romantic. Pliny the Younger, writing to a friend in 97 AD, described attending the wedding of a cousin's daughter. The girl was 14, the groom was 37. After the public ceremony, the prayers, the procession, the ritual jokes that always accompanied Roman weddings, the guests departed. But tradition required that a group of married women, all of whom had living children, remain to prepare the bride and ensure the marriage was properly consummated. Pliny waited in an adjoining room with the other male guests, drinking wine while they listened to the murmured instructions through the wall. The bride was crying softly. One of the older women's voices rose slightly. "Tears are natural, child, but silence is required. Your husband's honor depends on your composure." An hour later, the women emerged and confirmed that the marriage was complete. The bride's mother embraced her daughter, who was still trembling and pale, makeup smeared. The groom appeared shortly after, received congratulations from his friends, and the party continued. Pliny noted in his letter that he felt vaguely troubled by the evening, but couldn't articulate why. "Perhaps," he wrote, "because I saw in her face something we are not meant to see." The precise moment a child realizes that the world is not what she was promised. The girl's experience was legally indistinguishable from what happened nightly in households across Rome. To the thousands of slave women who had no contracts, no dowries, no legal existence that could be violated, a slave owner could use any slave sexually without legal consequences. Children born to slave women became the property of the mother's owner, regardless of paternity. The euphemism Romans used was vernae, houseborn slaves who had never known freedom, often fathered by the men who owned them. Marcus Varro, writing an agricultural manual in the 1st century BC, included advice on slave management that revealed this system's casual brutality. Female slaves of good appearance should be encouraged to breed with the strongest male slaves to produce valuable offspring. However, the master should also avail himself of such females as he wishes, as this demonstrates his authority and prevents them from developing inappropriate attachments to slave partners. This wasn't a fringe opinion. It was conventional wisdom, recorded in a farming manual as casually as advice about crop rotation. The complexity of Roman sexuality extended beyond the heteropatriarchal dynamics of marriage and slave ownership. Roman men's relationships with other males operated according to social codes that had nothing to do with modern concepts of sexual orientation and everything to do with dominance. The distinction that mattered wasn't whether you had sex with men or women, it was whether you were penetrating or being penetrated. A Roman citizen could take the active role with anyone of lower social status without censure. Slaves, foreigners, prostitutes, even free adolescent boys undergoing mentorship. But to be penetrated, to assume the passive role, was to surrender the dominance that defined Roman citizenship itself. This wasn't merely a social preference, it was written into law. The Lex Scantinia, passed in the 2nd century BC, imposed harsh penalties on citizens who allowed themselves to be penetrated by other men. Emperor Hadrian's relationship with Antinous tested these boundaries. Antinous was Greek, beautiful beyond any contemporary comparison, and young when Hadrian met him during a tour of the eastern provinces. The emperor was besotted in a way that Romans found unsettling, not because the relationship was homosexual, but because Hadrian's obvious emotional dependency suggested he had surrendered the psychological dominance expected of a Roman ruler. When Antinous drowned in the Nile in 130 AD, whether by accident, suicide, or ritual sacrifice remains debated, Hadrian's grief was overwhelming. He deified the young man, founded a city in his honor, commissioned hundreds of statues, and established mystery cult worship. Rome's aristocracy watched this display with discomfort. Grief was acceptable. This level of grief, for someone who should have been merely a pleasant companion, suggested that Hadrian had allowed himself to love in a way that compromised his imperial dignity. Yet even as Rome policed who could love whom and how, the actual sex was everywhere, commodified and regulated by the state. Prostitution operated within elaborate legal frameworks. Meretrices were registered sex workers who paid taxes on their earnings and worked from licensed brothels. Ancillae were slave women rented out by their owners. Famosi were free women who had lost their social respectability through scandal and fallen into informal prostitution. The brothel preserved in Pompeii's ruins reveals the working conditions. Rooms were stone cubicles barely large enough for a narrow bed, with explicit frescoes on the walls depicting various sexual acts, a menu for clients who couldn't read. Graffiti covers the walls, scratched there by customers and workers alike. Restituta, you move your hips so sweetly. Felix sucked me here for 2 asses. Successa the weaver, loves Iris the slave. She'd give anything for her. That last inscription is particularly haunting. A free woman expressing love for a female slave, preserved on a brothel wall, a moment of genuine feeling in a space defined by commercial transaction. Roman medical knowledge about sexuality mixed accurate observation with cultural assumptions that sometimes proved deadly. Physicians understood reproduction's mechanics and developed surgical techniques for sexual injuries, but their treatments reflected beliefs about gender that influenced their prescriptions. Soranus of Ephesus, writing in the 2nd century AD, believed women needed to experience pleasure to conceive, not for their own sake, but because orgasm supposedly opened the womb and drew semen inward. This meant husbands seeking heirs had a medical obligation to ensure their wives' satisfaction. Yet Soranus also warned that excessive female pleasure was dangerous, creating an insatiable appetite that would drive women to adultery and moral collapse. For contraception, Soranus recommended insertive barriers made of wool soaked in honey, cedar resin, or olive oil. Women desperate to prevent pregnancy tried more dangerous methods, drinking solutions of copper sulfate, iron rust, or crushed beetles. The plant silphium, which grew only in a limited region of Libya and was eventually harvested to extinction, was so valued for its contraceptive properties that it appeared on Cyrenian coins and sold for its weight in silver. When contraception failed, abortion was legally permitted. Roman law viewed the fetus as part of the mother's body, but the procedures were brutal. Women consumed toxic plants like pennyroyal, rue, and savin, which induced miscarriage by poisoning the entire system. Those who survived the herbs but remained pregnant underwent mechanical procedures using bronze instruments that frequently caused hemorrhaging, infection, or permanent damage. Pliny the Elder witnessed one such procedure and recorded it with his characteristic detachment. The woman had consumed various herbs for 3 days without effect and was growing desperate. A Greek physician inserted bronze instruments while she bit down on a leather strap and her female relatives held her still. The procedure ended the pregnancy, but infection followed. She died within the week, her family attributing her death to fever rather than acknowledge the true cause. Every aspect of Roman intimate life was shaped by the same power dynamics that structured the empire's military and political hierarchies. Who could touch whom, when, and how was never a private matter. It reflected and reinforced the social order that kept Rome stable. Perhaps nowhere is this more evident than in Roman beauty rituals, which were simultaneously acts of self-care and slow-motion poisoning. Wealthy women painted their faces with white lead to achieve the pale complexion that signified aristocratic leisure, freedom from outdoor labor. They rouged their cheeks and lips with mercury-based compounds. They lined their eyes with antimony and other toxic metals. Martial, the Spanish-born poet living in Rome during the 1st century AD, described watching a senator's wife undergo her daily cosmetics routine. Her slaves mix white lead with vinegar until it forms a paste thick enough to cover every imperfection. They paint her face until she resembles a theatrical mask. Then they add crimson to her lips, mercury and cochineal creating a shade that looks like freshly drawn blood. When she speaks, I imagine I can taste the metal. When she smiles, I wonder how long before the tremors begin. The tremors were mercury poisoning. The facial paralysis, the cognitive decline, the eventual death. These were known side effects. Yet the beauty standard demanded the poison. To appear without the white lead complexion was to look like a slave, a field worker, someone who had to toil under the sun. Better to die beautiful than live looking common. The same calculus applied to depilation. Both men and women of the upper classes removed virtually all body hair using methods that bordered on torture. Heated bronze tweezers, pine resin wax, even pumice stones scraped across the skin until hair and flesh both came away. Specialized slaves called alipilari spent hours performing these procedures. Seneca, the Stoic philosopher who lived through much of the 1st century AD, complained about the noise from the bathhouse beneath his apartment. The grunting of men lifting weights, the slapping of flesh during massages, the cries of those having their hair plucked. The worst sound is the high, thin scream of a customer having his armpits plucked, which continues at intervals throughout the day. These weren't screams of pleasure. They were screams of pain, endured because Roman beauty standards demanded smooth skin, and the pain was simply the price of maintaining one's social position. Standing in the ruins of Pompeii today, among the plaster casts of bodies frozen in their final moments, you can see evidence of all of this. The explicit frescoes that decorated middle-class homes, the worn grooves in brothel beds, the cosmetics jars still containing traces of lead and mercury, the surgical instruments for abortions, the marriage contracts sealed in bronze. But you can also see something else in the graffiti, the personal letters preserved by ash, the small objects people carried with them when they fled. Evidence that despite the systematic inequalities, the legal prostitution, the child marriages, and the poisonous beauty standards, Romans still fell in love. They still wrote poems to people they couldn't have. They still grieved lovers who died young. They still carved, "I was here with the one I love," into walls, desperate to make their private happiness public even briefly. The Romans weren't monsters. They were humans operating within systems that seemed natural and inevitable to them, the same way our own social arrangements seem natural to us. They genuinely believed that some people were meant to rule and others to serve, that some bodies belonged to their owners and others to themselves, that gender determined destiny and social class determined worth. And 2,000 years from now, archaeologists will excavate our ruins and find evidence of our own systematic inequalities, preserved in digital archives and material culture. They'll see the gaps in our justice, the hierarchies in our intimacy, the ways we organized human life according to categories that felt permanent, but were merely historical. The volcanic ash that preserved Pompeii didn't just freeze a moment of disaster. It created a mirror that reflects across the centuries, showing us that the distance between Roman sexuality and our own isn't a simple line from primitive to enlightened, from barbaric to civilized. It's more complicated than that. We've just gotten better at hiding the transactions, packaging the inequalities in gentler language, pretending that love has ever existed outside the structures of power. Those frozen Romans in their final positions, their intimate lives suddenly exposed by catastrophe. They're not warning us about ancient depravity. They're reminding us that every culture's most private moments reveal its deepest truths about who counts as fully human and who doesn't, about who gets to choose and who gets chosen, about which bodies are protected and which are available. The secrets they carried to their deaths weren't buried by the ash. They just learned to speak in different languages, hide behind different customs, and call themselves different names. But they're still here, still whispering from the ruins, still asking us to look honestly at the foundations upon which we've built our own versions of intimacy, love, and power.